Hi, I am Jeffrey Wernick, and I'm here with Bruce Fein, which means we are having another episode of Fine Points. Today, Bruce has said he would like to speak about the beginnings of this first short period of time of the beginning of the Trump administration. As usual, I like to give some opening remarks. And my opening remarks are going to a lot of people are saying, are concerned that we have already have a constitutional crisis. There are those that are saying anybody that says that it just suffers from Trump derangement syndrome. So I think if we're going to refer to somebody that knows something about the Constitution, and the intents of the constitutional government, I think James Madison is probably the best source since he's the main author. So I'm going to take a couple of quotes from James Madison. Madison said, "Crisis is the rallying cry of the tyrant." Okay. I think that's basically all we're hearing now is crisis, crisis. I'm saving the country. Because I'm saving the country means no law applies to me because I'm asserting that I'm saving the country. And there are a whole bunch of people who agree that I'm saving the country. So between me and me saying it and the fact that other people agree with it means that I am above the law and no law applies to me and nothing I do is illegal. Somehow, some people are arguing, I guess that's part of the Constitution. I haven't found James Madison anywhere drawing an exception to the president that if the president is deemed to be a savior by himself or herself, and a certain quantity of people agree to it, that means that the Constitution's got suspended and they can do whatever they want. So, maybe Clarence Thomas will find that in the Constitution. Maybe Alito will also find it in the Constitution. So, they found total immunity for a president in the Constitution. So, who knows what else they'll find in the Constitution? As they're rewriting it. Also, for people who say that when Trump says I was elected to do all these things, so I'm doing what the people elected. Madison said the purpose of the Constitution is to restrict the majority's ability to harm a minority. So nobody was elected to have that type of absolute power. That's what James Madison said. Maybe nobody on the Supreme Court actually believes in James Madison anymore. Yet they still, of course, say they believe in the Constitution. So James Madison also said the accumulation of all powers, legislative, executive, and judiciary in the same hands, whether of one, a few, or many, and whether hereditary, self-appointed, or elective, may justly be pronounced the very definition of tyranny. So the system was designed with a very limited government. Most of the power and authority was really delegated to the states and the people. The federal branch had few enumerated rights. The Bill of Rights was put there to place a lot of restrictions on the federal government. And the thing that after defeating the king, the last thing they wanted was an imperial president. So it's what seems to be deranged is American president who would prefer to quote Napoleon than James Madison. Okay. So what kind of world do we live in that quoting James Madison makes you deranged, but the person we should cite as a way of what our government is supposed to represent is the guy who coronated himself emperor. That's the person who should be our source of wisdom, for a constitutional republic. The person who destroyed a republic, and replaced it as an empire, and then used the military to expand, that empire. So, so I think it seems to me, Madison also said that president, and then I'll turn it over to Bruce. A president is impeachable if he attempts to subvert the Constitution. I really don't know how anyone could deny he's attempted to subvert the Constitution. And I don't even the fact that it's even a question is and as Bruce will reassert, impeachment doesn't mean you throw him out of office. Impeachment is an act of saying, you've done this. We could slap your hand on the wrist and say, we're giving you full warning, that the Constitution limits your power, and we're checking it. We don't have to remove you from office, but we're making a statement. Where to check to make sure you don't expand upon the boundaries of what the Constitution determined, is the legitimate powers, of the president. So, so how anyone can think that there's not been a subversion of the Constitution, is on. And I'm going to say one other thing. Sorry, Bruce. Don't conflate the issue of being concerned about this usurpation of power, of being against shrinking of government, and that the only way we can shrink government is through a savior, that's either Trump or Musk or a tag team of Trump and Musk. Okay. We were not designed as a government of savers. Okay. We were a government of the people, by the people, for the people, not a government of saviors. Okay. We're subjects of waiting for our saviors to do for us what we supposedly can't do for ourselves. Trump likes to say he likes Bill McKinley. He wants to expand the U.S. Bill McKinley. He wants to finance the government, the way McKinley financed the government. Well, I'll tell this to Trump, to Musk, to all the doggies out there. Okay, I don't mind you using tariffs to which by the Constitution comes from the legislative branch, not the executive branch. We're not an emergency. We're not in a depression. Okay, so there is no economic crisis in the country. And Trump, as a matter of fact, tells us how great the economy is. So how can we be in an economic crisis at the same time while the economy is great? So at the same time, while the U.S. economy is outperforming most of the global economy, supposedly we're in a crisis. Okay, that's just BS. Okay, so we are not in an economic crisis. But I will agree to tariffs. I will support the tariffs to finance the government. If Trump can reduce spending as a percentage of GDP to the level it was when McKinley was president. So let's look at the time when McKinley was president. Okay, federal spending as a percentage of GDP was 2.7%. Trump must get us to 2.7% with Congress's support. Present a budget that gets spending down to 2.7% and have it funded exclusively by tariffs. Okay, I would be on board for that if you could go and lobby the people and convince the people that the Republican Party, which you control, absolutely, you have absolute control over the party. So you have absolute control of the party. Spend federal spending down to 3% of GDP. Okay, get Musk's advice on how to do it and present everything to Congress and have Congress vote on a budget that is 3%. And then with that, you'll abolish the income tax. You'll abolish most of the rules and regulations. Let's get to the type of regulatory state that existed when McKinley was president in 1900, which would also mean we have no Fed, okay? Which also meant that money was gold. So, I would love to see that proposal. You have absolute control over it. So I don't want this to be conflated as the fact is that I love government, I love big spending, I love the government corruption. No, okay? I'm sure I'm a bigger opponent of government than either Musk or Trump is, okay? So don't conflate the issue that the only way to get spending down, the only way to get control and end corruption is through a savior. No, that's not the way we do it. That's not America, okay? James Madison would not endorse that. Bruce,
yeah,
over to you.
Wonderful opening. Let me address many of them. First of all, you're absolutely right about Madison, and add that he said the instruments of power, claim to be necessary to address dangers abroad, come back and destroy liberty at home. He knew these fantastical claims of crisis were just euphemisms to destroy your liberties. If we want to give one example today, remember Trump has proclaimed a national emergency on the southern border. He sent military troops there. There's stories today, they can't find anybody. We got 10,000 troops on the border with Mexico. There's no enemy there, right? It's invisible enemy.
I'll add one other comment. At the time of Trump's inauguration, because they already had the border had already gotten significantly under control the latter part of 2024. The amount of people flowing from Mexico into the United States was comparable to near its low point in 2019 during the Trump administration.
Yeah, and so it was
the executive order, the emergency didn't exist. There might have been an emergency in 2023 or the beginning of 2024, but at the time when he signed that executive order, the emergency was gone.
Yeah, in fact, it was lower. The illegal migration was lower than when Trump left office. You figure, wait a minute, if it's that low, why wasn't Trump declaring this during his first term? So we know this is simply a political stunt. The second thing that's important to note about Madison, and it's the only time, Jeffrey, in the history of the world where this has been done by an executive. In 1810, Congress, the Senate, wanted to give him power to go to war on his own in order to stop British and French predation on our maritime commerce. He wrote back and said, you can't give that to me. You have to accept responsibility for war. That's how separation of powers works. And he worked with his son-in-law in the House to kill the bill. No other president, no other executive in the history of the world who has ever said, you can't give me the war power. And truly, Madison, yes, he was the genius. He was what I would call the Isaac Newton of the Constitutional Convention. And separation of powers was uniquely his brainchild. Nobody else wrote about that in the Federalist Papers. It was all Madison. And he understood that because we're not angels, we have to protect ourselves from ourselves. And that's why he said we need a constitution, because it's bad to have a monarch. It's bad to have an elected monarch is as bad as it is to have one who's appointed or hereditary. And the whole idea of the Constitution is to say certain rights don't depend on the outcome of elections. That's why we have a Constitution. So when you hear this argument today, well, Trump is just doing what he's elected to do, there's certain things you can't get elected to do. You can't get elected to destroy the Constitution. It's above you, and it's supposed to be enforced by independent courts. I'm hoping maybe the U.S. Supreme Court will understand the folly of Trump versus the United States and back away when they see kind of what they've unleashed, the Sorcerer's Apprentice here. But that's got to be understood. And in fact, I think, Jeffrey, that's the understanding of the framers, is that it's true that having separation of powers will make government slow, and it may be unable to act as swiftly with a dictator. But they said the cure is worse than the disease. Slowness is better than a dictator that's going to destroy all of your liberties. And so when we hear today, well, it's gridlock, we can't go through Congress, it's too slow. Well, it's not perfect. It's never going to be perfect because mankind's made of crooked timber. But the alternative is far worse. Mainly, you lose all of your liberties under a dictatorial regime. And what's striking here, and the main difference that I detect between today, 50 years after Watergate and Watergate, is the Congress has turned into an ink blot. They're cheering the president ruling by executive order. It reminds me of the Reichstag in Germany after Hitler and the Enabling Act, where it was simply a rubber stamp. Congress is holding no hearings on all of this that Elon Musk. That's the business of Congress. They have the power of the purse. They're doing nothing here. Now, I would repeat and echo what you said, Jeffrey, about I'm all in favor of a small government, probably as small as you want. I think other than national defense, which should be solely self-defense, the only thing I would get the government involved in is education alone, just in encouraging the cerebral over the hormonal faculties. Other than that, we all get to march to our own drummers. They have a police, but that's a local phenomenon. Otherwise, the government will always screw things up. And it's not because I believe the private sector is perfect. I repeat, human beings aren't perfect. It's not going to be perfect. But I have been in Washington, I think, over 50 years. The government always acts with an ulterior motive. It never, ever is motivated to help the American people. And therefore, you want to keep it as small as possible, because even given the defects in the private sector, they're less defective than when you turn it over to government. Just think of the difference between the U.S. Post Office and FedEx, right? It tells you what happens when you have private motivation as opposed to the government running the post office, or the VA hospitals as opposed to private hospitals. I'm not saying that the people are bad in government. They're like everyone else, but the incentives are all wrong-headed. Political math is not economic math. And that's why the government was intended to be relatively small, except for these functions. Unfortunately, I think because we lost sight of separation of powers, we decided, no, it's not good to be a country that's not a world power, but celebrates liberty. Let's be a world power. Let's dominate everyone. That's what came with Manifest Destiny. manifest too. Well, now suddenly, after all the framers died off, it's manifest that we're supposed to rule the world. And that's what Trump quoted from in his inaugural address, which was rather alarming to somebody like me. No, I don't want to go back and fight another Mexican-American war, which is, even someone as ruthless as U.S. Grant said, it was the worst war he'd ever participated in. It reminded him of wars in Europe, Napoleonic wars. Now, the other thing I'd observe about the difference today and at our founding, to show how far away we are from that time, George Washington was offered, at the time the Revolutionary War was won, he was said, here, you can be a king. He turned to us, I said, I didn't fight this revolution to be a king. I don't want to be a king. I will never be a king. He went back to Mount Vernon. He didn't even want to be president. He had to be importuned by Madison and Jefferson and George Mason. You have to come, because otherwise the country is too fragmented to join. He didn't want to serve 2 terms. After 1 term, he said, I need to go back. They importuned him again. You need to stay another term. And the idea, and George Washington was one, as president said, that I cannot exercise the war power. It is in Congress. Only Congress can decide when we use the military in an offensive way. Otherwise, my hands are tied. That's who we have. That was the understanding of the government. Those are the kind of people that we had who are operating, our institutions.
Yeah, I on that point, Bruce, today I wrote a tweet on a post on X on behalf of BitChute, alluding to the fact that yesterday was President's Day, and that President's Day is sandwiched in between, Lincoln's birthday and Washington's birthday. Lincoln's being the 12th and Washington's being the 22nd, and how since the Civil War, how Washington's birthday has been celebrated and honored and commemorated by the Senate is the reading of his farewell address, which for a long period of time was considered one of our most important civics documents. In civics lessons, was reading Washington's farewell address. That's all but forgotten. And I point out, in the post that I made, is that first you had King George III say, after winning the revolution, if Washington goes and retires, hangs up his soldier's uniform and returns to private life, that would make him the greatest man in the world.
Yeah.
So, and that's what Washington did. So, according to the person he defeated, called him the greatest man in the world. Okay, that's the person he just won war with. Okay, not the British Empire, the greatest empire at that point in time in history, and he led the effort to defeat the British. And the British king said, "This man is the greatest man in the world."
Yeah, and then we'll go on.
And he goes home. He goes home. Then he comes back to become president of the convention, of the Constitutional Convention, and now talking about someone who claimed that they got a mandate. He got every electoral vote twice. Every electoral vote. All they're not listening. Okay, he didn't get 55 or 60% of the electoral votes. He got 100% of the electoral votes twice. Okay, and after getting it once, as you said, he wanted to go home. He had to be convinced on how unique his role was. Okay, so he came back a second time, but after the second time, he said, "Enough! I'm going home. I've earned my time. I've earned my ability to go home. I'm turning it over to the next generation." Okay, so that's an act of greatness, not people exploring, finding out if there's some way to justify, within the Constitution, that if their terms are not consecutive or whatever, you can run again, or maybe expand to another term. Sorry. So mentioning Washington,
I think
President's Day was more than just honoring Donald Trump. People should remember that we owe our freedoms to other people, and it should be a reminder that it's at this time, because it was sandwiched specifically because previously the only presidents we honored were Washington and Lincoln, and that's why we have President's Day at this time of the year. It's between the two, so basically we could celebrate both of them. So and why soon? So I encourage everyone to read Washington's farewell address. It's one of the most important, greatest civics documents, in my opinion. I don't know what you think about that, Bruce.
Yeah, it's just really true, Jeffrey. I mean, one of the things that he underscores in the farewell address is that even if the Constitution may be imperfect in some ways, we comply with it and we amend it if we think it needs further refinement. But the worst thing that he anticipated was lawlessness. He also very much deplored political parties. He thought that would be the bane of the Constitution because he thought correctly loyalty would be to the party rather than the Constitution. But I want to give one more example of how great George Washington was, distinguishing it from current occupants of office. At the Constitutional Convention, when it came time to negotiate certain compromises, he stood up and he said, and he was the presiding officer, "Let us set a standard to which the wise and honest may repair." He didn't talk about let us set a standard so billionaires can come in and buy us off. Let's do a transactional so the wise and honest may repair. And that was an inspiration to the other delegates there. And remember, Washington is surrounded by literal demagogues. Jefferson, James Madison, Hamilton, George Mason, these are giants in their own right. And every one of them deferred to Washington because of his immaculate character. They knew it was nothing about George Washington. It was all about the ideas and the country. We haven't had a president like that since Abe Lincoln. And let's pay a little bit of attention to Abraham Lincoln. First of all, he understood the abuses of limitless power as a member of Congress, and he voted to have a resolution which passed the House declaring the Mexican-American War, built on a lie, was illegal and unconstitutional because President James K. Polk lied about it. Now, there's many misunderstandings, I believe, about President Lincoln during the Civil War. It's true that he confronted a crisis and did things at the outset after the firing on Fort Sumter that Congress alone could do. But he didn't simply assert these unilateral powers and claim I'm a king because there's a crisis. He went to Congress and said, you have authority to do these things. I don't have authority to do them unilaterally, but you can approve them, ratify them retroactively, which Congress did. He didn't try to hide anything. He said, you could impeach me because in this time of emergency, I went beyond what the Constitution provided, but you can ratify what I did retroactively, which is exactly what Congress did. So the idea that Lincoln flouted the Constitution is wrong-headed. Congress approved everything he did, and he acted openly and with transparency. And he is the one who celebrated the rule of law more than anything else. One of the things that shows how strong he felt concerns this odious case, Dred Scott versus Sanford. In 1857, the United States Supreme Court held that blacks, even free blacks, had no rights that white men were bound to respect. President Lincoln was appalled at that decision. He opposed it at the time. But in his first inaugural, he said, as bad as the decision is, we have to comply with the facts of the case unless we have an amendment or it's overruled. Because he said the consequences of being able to pick and choose what cases to comply with are so horrendous, it's a cure far worse than the disease. So we have to stick with the Constitution, which he did. They overturned Dred Scott versus Sanford in the 14th Amendment and the 13th Amendment. He did it the constitutional way. Think of these statements compared to what we hear today. Well, we don't have to comply with what courts do. They may be going beyond the Constitution, that we should be able to interpret our own powers. Think of this, Jeffrey, for perhaps 1,000 years, a root of Anglo-American jurisprudence is you cannot be a judge in your own case, right? You cannot be a judge in your own case. Now we're hearing from the executive branch, we decide what our own powers are. Really? You think you're ever going to deny you don't have limitless power? That's the gist of what the vice president has said explicitly. Mr. Trump has said it less explicitly, although he did say in his first term, and this is July 23rd, 2019, then I have Article 2 where I have the right to do anything I want as president. That's his proclamation of how he interprets his own authority. So the whole idea that we're listening to today from the Trump administration, sometimes it's the subtext, sometimes it's a little more subtle, that we will decide what court decisions we want to obey if we think they're reasonable or not, really means the end of constitutional law. I cannot imagine any executive branch, certainly not people like Biden and Trump, saying, I'm interpreting my own powers and I can't go that far. Right? It's not going to happen. Never have the executive branch deny it can do whatever it wants. And that's, I say, we keep hearing these kind of rumblings because the initial setbacks that Musk and Trump have encountered have been at the lower courts, but implicit is the idea we go all the way up, and if we can't get what we want in the Court of Appeals or the Supreme Court, we may just decide we will flout the law. Now, given that the standard for impeachment is efforts to subvert the Constitution are impeachable, it doesn't have to succeed. My view is that we've already heard enough from this executive branch to say we're removing you from power. We can no longer entrust our liberties, our stewardship of the Constitution to you because you are unreliable and we need someone else. First, it may be J.D. Vance, it may be Mike Johnson, or we may have to go down further on the roster or find someone who will honor the Constitution. But I think that it would be incredible to anybody at the Constitution Convention to hear the words and see the actions of this administration and not say, we don't have to wait, until the Constitution is burned in flames and there's not anything but ashes left. We can take this as a prophylactic measure. And I feel compelled, Jeffrey, to underscore to our audience, impeachment oftentimes is written about as if it were the guillotine in the French Revolution. It is the peaceable way in which we remove someone from power. We don't send them to Siberia. You can no longer occupy positions in the U.S. government. You can live your life and comply with the law. That's fine. We need somebody else to rule. It's just, it happens all the time, as you know, Jeffrey, in the private sphere, corporations, you get rid of the CEO, he's not operating properly, you remove him, he doesn't go to Siberia, he loses his job. That's basically how impeachment works. And it works not by any arbitrary way. It's after there's a deliberation in the House, a trial in the Senate, presided over by the Chief Justice, and then people vote. And it's by 2/3 vote in the Senate. So, and I also view this idea that, we can't always be impeaching presidents as kind of a scarecrow. Because once you impeach and remove the president once, it wouldn't happen a second time. Presidents love power too much to risk, losing that office. And presidents would be deterred from following their predecessor who was impeached and removed. So those are the observations of what we can.
First, I'd like to give your comment some context, especially for people who might be watching or listening to this. So that, again, you're not accused of having Trump derangement system. Donald Trump is not the only president in your lifetime that you believe has committed impeachable offenses, correct?
I have worked on impeachments against Nixon, Clinton, Bush 1, Barack Obama, Biden, and Trump. I think that covers the waterfront. The only one I escaped would be Jimmy Carter, but even he went too far when he said, if you cut off oil from the Persian Gulf, I'm going to war. He didn't have authority to do that, but he was late in his administration, probably wasn't warned impeachment. So
the point is you're applying an equal standard, a neutral standard, where the standard is basically very simple. Have they subverted the Constitution? Very simple. You don't care whether they're Democrats, Republicans. You don't care about their ideology. What the ideology that you respect is reverence for the Constitution, that the president has sworn all presidents swear an oath of office where they swear to uphold the Constitution, and those that have violated that oath, you believe, as I do, that they deserve impeachment, and you have a laundry list of those, which are basically the majority of those in your lifetime. You think have warranted impeachment, and I would agree with that list. So so neither you or I are thinking that the first time in our lifetimes that we think a president has subverted the Constitution and deserves to be tried as having committed an impeachable offense, that Trump is not the first one we're applying this principle to. That you and I, if we were in Congress, in the House, we would have used our powers as members of Congress to apply the impeachment on a number of presidents who we each believe have committed impeachable offenses and independent of their political ideology.
Yes, and Jeffrey, I could offer this as my personal footnote in my background. When I came to the Justice Department during Watergate, I was given the task after the Saturday Night Massacre that resulted in the resignations of the Attorney General and Deputy by then acting Attorney General Robert Bork, our Supreme Court or would-be Supreme Court fame, to review and examine everything about impeachment because it hadn't been on the table since 1868, more than 100 years since Andrew Johnson. So I went through and I examined everything, all the impeachment trials of Andrew Johnson, and looked at this and said, wow, this clearly, what Nixon is doing was impeachable. The cover-up, the lying, the burglary of Daniel Ellsberg, psychiatrist, the plumbers, and all of that. That really is minor compared to what we can see today in terms of complete shredding the United States Constitution. So I think even at age 25, that was my immersion, my baptism, so to speak, in Washington. I never was overly impressed with power. It was always brains. It was always the checks and balances, wisdom that commanded obedience, not raw power. And impeachment is one expression of that idea.
Most jobs in Washington, and again, neither you or I believe are in the regulatory state or the administrative state. So, maybe if it was up to you and I, we would abolish, at least for me, I would abolish almost every regulatory body that exists. So I don't want to sound like I'm sympathetic towards a regulatory body, but I am sympathetic to rule of law. If a regulatory body exists by an act of Congress, okay, and we're populating with people to do the job as Congress enabled legislation that gave them delegated responsibility to them to do that. Most of the people in these positions, the execution of their job is something technical in nature. It's not like if you're in the SEC or in places like that. It's not necessarily an ideological position. It's a technical position, and few people make policy. Most people who have these jobs are not ones in positions where they make policies. They're the ones who enforce them. They don't write the rules. They enforce the rules. So so if we're supposedly having a merit-based system, how is a merit-based system consistent with all these people having to define whether they're ideologically in agreement with the president and swear an oath of loyalty, to the president, which would seem to be a contradiction to their oath of office to the Constitution, and they're not. And as much as Trump would like them to mean the same thing, well, actually, I think he would think the oath to himself, as he already asked Mike Pence, that he should place the loyalty to Trump over loyalty to the Constitution. So,
for that, let me jump in here.
So this concept that they really want, things to be determined by just pure merit is garbage.
Yeah, it is. It is complete absurdity. But let's go back to the administrative state, Jeffrey, because I think echo chamber view. I would eliminate most all of certainly the federal regulatory agencies. There can be problems. The states can deal with that at state level. But a couple of observations I think are warranted here. One, working in Republican administrations, we were able to deregulate consistent with the rule of law. The Interstate Commerce Commission had stood around for like 100 years. It was regulating a license carrying, chairs and furniture from one city to another. It was insane. But we went to Congress, we got it repealed. The same way with the Civil Aeronautics Board, which is regulating airlines and whether they could put ketchup on your sandwiches when you flew. And again, it was utter inanity what they were trying to do with the regulation. But we got airline deregulation. We did railroad deregulation. We got motor vehicle, trucking deregulation. But that's how the rule of law worked. No one in their right mind at that time thought, well, President Reagan just abolished the agency. Just lay everybody off, don't enforce any rules, and they'll just die on the vine. So the idea that you can't work with the rule of law to get deregulation is wrong. The other observation is that there is an element in regulation. I call it the below the radar screen element. It's very dangerous to our democracy. And that is when you have the tentacles of government control an important component of your livelihood through regulation, it's going to cause you to be silent. You will not discharge your duties as a citizen to criticize government that you otherwise might, because you're hoping to avoid regulatory backlash, which you witnessed. That's why it was quite alarming when we saw on Trump's inaugural platform, all these billionaires, AI, whatever, they're there for one reason. They are trying to protect themselves from the regulations that Trump could utilize to go after them. When we think about, for example, why some of these media companies are now settling some of these lawsuits with Mr. Trump, ABC, then the Meta and others, the reason isn't because the lawsuits, I've looked at them, have merit, that, hey, this is how you buy your favor with Mr. Trump. And so the regulatory state induces silence, citizen silence, on behalf of important people who should be speaking out.
It's almost an extortion racket.
Yeah, it's an extortion racket, exactly right. And therefore, even if it can do some good, as I understand the free market isn't perfect, but the government typically makes it worse rather than better. But still, you have to try to incorporate the understanding is that you're going to induce docility in the citizenry in government overreach, because everyone's going to fear we're going to antagonize the government, and therefore I should stay silent so they won't cut off my Social Security check, they won't approve this merger, they won't give me this license, which is very, very bad and damaging.
We don't know all the data that Musk. This whole thing about DOGE now is like very confusing in the sense of, first I think they filed an affidavit with the court that basically said Musk has nothing to do with DOGE. That Musk is just a counselor to Trump, a personal advisor to Trump. So, and that's his only role, and he has no involvement. Basically, they present it as if he had zero influence over anything DOGE does. So I wonder who actually believes that. I wonder who actually believes they're giving him all the credit for it. So he should get zero credit for it if he has nothing to do with it. So if he just went to Trump and said, I think you should create an office that says Department of Government Efficiency, and I got some recommendations from people, that I think should be part of it, and he hasn't been part of the vetting of the people. He hasn't been influencing the hiring. So he just said, here's some names, good luck, and call me when you have a question. That's basically the relationship the Justice Department, I think it was the Justice Department, filed in this, and in front of I think it was Tanya Chutkin, when she's asking questions about Musk's role, in DOGE because of the lawsuit, against DOGE, and they're trying to understand Musk's role. That basically they just said he's not even part of it. So the whole world is giving him credit for something he's not a part of, and he certainly has made no assertions himself that that DOGE has nothing to do with him. That periodically, and we're supposed to believe that all these decisions all these decisions being made about eliminating all these people and every one of their work, the people are reporting it to Trump, not to Musk. And then Trump is consulting Musk on all these issues. So Trump is running doggy, okay? And Musk is just there periodically when, hey, Elon, I got a couple of questions here. I want to hear your opinion. So, that's what we're supposed to believe is the structure, of this. I want to know how many people really believe that. How many really believe that basically Musk is mostly a bystander who just gave a few names, and whenever Trump calls him and says, "I have a question here, give me some advice," okay, thank you for your advice, and then Trump's making the final decision. So probably the truth is probably, I could be wrong, is that Trump has delegated all this to Musk. So and
Jeff,
they've created this fiction.
You've left out that Musk has a bed in the EOB adjacent to the White House. He sleeps there to the extent that he sleeps. He's living literally within a stone's throw of the White House, the Oval Office. And you're exactly right. You can see there is a current lawsuit, which I think is well founded, arguing that de facto Elon Musk is a principal officer of the United States and he must be confirmed by the Senate. He's acting in violation of the Appointments Clause because he certainly de facto is exercising far more power than the cabinet heads. In fact, he goes around the cabinet heads. They take orders from him, not the other way around. They're all viewed as principal officers. They had to go for confirmation. And you can see that if this kind of arrangement passes constitutional muster, then the Senate confirmation power becomes simply a joke. President Trump simply hires his own people. He says, you'll be a special appointee. You're de facto. He announces to all his cabinet, you pay attention to this special employee head, and he's speaking for me, but he's not officially given a title that says I'm a principal officer, so he escapes any Senate confirmation and the oversight, which to say is another dagger at the whole idea of separation of powers. I think that if there were serious confirmation hearings of Musk, we would see the enormous conflicts of interest that he has, that indeed, while he pledges that he's trying to downsize government, he's perhaps one of the biggest beneficiaries of big government around, with NASA and Tesla and the tax credits and the solar panels and things of that sort. And now where he's getting into AI as well.
I think in 2019, in 2019, I think Musk had acknowledged that without the tax credits, Tesla would have likely gone bankrupt. So Musk is the wealthiest man today because of tax credits conveyed to him, during the Trump administration and maybe during the Obama administration. So there might have been not just unique of the Trump administration, but it could have been, both Obama and Trump administrations. But Tesla survived because of the American taxpayer. So, but the American taxpayer has not shared in the upside of Tesla, even though Musk pretty much acknowledged, and Trump actually made this comment himself that when he and Musk was somewhat feuding, that Musk was a beneficiary and accrued his wealth, at the backs of the taxpayers. The value of the tax credit, was more than 15%, of the value of the car. I think about like $7,500. I mean, it was a huge tax credit per car. So the American people were financing Elon Musk, and in return for him turning a bankrupt company into the wealthiest person in the world, it seemed like the taxpayer didn't get to share very much in the upside. He got money from the government he could not get from the private sector. So it wasn't merit-based money he got, okay? So the marketplace determines merit for companies, okay? Not the government does. So if the marketplace determines merit in the private sector, okay, the private sector determined at that point in time Musk did not merit money, okay? So the government stepped in and gave him money that that in the private marketplace would not provide for him. So so it was okay when he was the beneficiary of the government money. It's not okay when other people are the beneficiary of government money.
Yeah. Let me expand on that, Jeffrey. Focus for a moment on two provisions in the U.S. Constitution. They're referred to colloquially as the domestic and foreign emoluments clause. That basically says that a president of the United States cannot receive any compensation other than the salary that's appropriated by the Congress to try to ensure that his loyalty is not diverted and deflected to some private benefactor, foreign or domestic. So we see these emoluments clauses, I believe, there's clearly flouted in spirit, if not in letter, when Trump continues to operate in his family this sprawling array of businesses, which it's open and notorious, foreign countries patronize and pay probably premium prices in order to ingratiate themselves with Trump. And Trump benefits because directly or indirectly, the profits of these enterprises flow back to him or his family. And he has refused to divest himself of the properties, put them in blind trust or something of that sort. It is an abuse that is characteristic of Washington, but it's not limited to Trump. Think about Hillary Clinton, Bill Clinton, and Hillary Clinton was Secretary of State. They have the Clinton Foundation. She's there. Suddenly, all this foreign money, Saudi Arabia, pours into the Clinton Foundation, all trying to ingratiate themselves with the Secretary of State. As soon as Hillary Clinton lost Secretary of State position, all the money dried up. Again, it's an abuse of power. The same way in which I think Hunter
Biden. People felt, even though it was never demonstrated, they couldn't follow the money of really how much of one is which one. I think first, as I say, many people who are near people of influence get paid lots of money because they're near people of influence. So that's not unique to Hunter Biden, that people pay somebody. What was Manafort's business? Okay. Yeah. Manafort got a lot more money than Hunter Biden got, and Manafort, was not an expert on a lot of the areas he was involved in. What he was an expert in was influence peddling, and influence peddling in the U.S. is a legal activity. So now I guess Trump is including bribing foreign officials is a legal activity, since he wants to, basically suspend the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. So, I mean, maybe it's because some members of his family, to facilitate their business, need to do things that might need to enrich the people they're doing it with. So he wants to make sure that those activities, are not considered, because they are doing a lot of, in the first administration, he claimed that Trump Organization would avoid doing transactions with foreign countries. The second time around, he's not limiting himself to that anymore. So maybe the abandoning the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act is maybe to facilitate, the Trump Organization, and other people, being able to do business overseas by paying bribes, because while it might not be legal in that country, it's common in that country, for doing business, even though in these countries it's actually illegal to do it, it's still common. So he's actually decriminalizing an act that's illegal in that country, even though it's prevalent, it's illegal in that country. So
Jeffrey, let me pause a second, because you've hit upon a very important constitutional point. What the president said, not only with regard to Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, which was enacted in 1977, so it's not a new statute, and also with regard to the Foreign Agents Registration Act and other provisions, he says, I'm just not going to enforce the law. Under Article 2, the president is obligated to take care that the laws be faithfully executed. He doesn't have the power to say, I'm going to de facto repeal the law by saying I'm not bringing any prosecution done to them. You can't do this consistent with the Constitution. Yet he makes the statement, there's no pushback from Congress, nothing. That by itself is an impeachable offense. This particular provision in the Constitution was central to the minds of the framers. It's borrowed from the 1689 English Bill of Rights, which was anchored by King James II wasn't enforcing the laws enacted by Parliament. And the Parliament English statement of the Bill of Rights, no, the executive must enforce the laws unless the Parliament agrees not to enforce them. The president is now asserting the power to say, I don't like the laws. I don't want to enforce them anymore. I won't have any lawyers assigned them. There'll be no money spent on them. That certainly is an effort which violates, I think, the express obligation to take care that the laws be faithfully executed. Now, that doesn't mean that we can have 100% enforcement because we don't have the resources that are capable of doing that. But it means that to the extent that you have resources, they have to be applied even-handedly to enforcing the laws on the books, or you can ask Congress to repeal them. But you don't get to decide, well, I don't like the law, I won't enforce it anymore. I mean, that's really frightening. Take, for example, there's been some hints, Jeffrey, that there's a law that prevents harassment of women attending clinics that offer abortions. It's criminal to try to harass and attack such women. Well, I mean, Trump could give a hint. Well, I don't like the law. A lot of anti-abortion constituents don't like the law, so I just won't enforce it. You free fire zone for the women seeking abortion, and this is it's the end of the rule of law in a different way.
Yeah, but I think, thank you for those comments, Bruce. I think one of the points I want to make, though, is from my understanding, Trump has surrendered governance rights over the Trump Organization, but he has not surrendered, and maybe you know the answer to this, his economic rights over the Trump Organization. So which means that I think that most of the economic benefits of everything the Trump Organization accrues to him.
Yeah. And moreover,
which is a lot different, so they're going out there. So basically the Trump Organization is an agent on him, on his behalf.
Yeah. And moreover, when you have a close-knit family,
shouldn't that be considered a problem? That you have an organization dealing with all these countries, and everybody who speaks to Eric knows that the main beneficiary of every conversation with Eric is the President of the United States, who has basically almost dictatorial powers, who's basically been given free reign to do whatever he wants by a Republican-controlled legislature, has basically determined that they have his back and letting him be an imperial president. So if Eric knocks on the door, and you're, a leader of some other country, and he wants to do a business deal, who do you think you're doing business with? You know that Eric's an agent on behalf of Trump, even though Trump has no governance role in the company. I mean, he's the main economic beneficiary of anything that happens in the organization. So people don't think that's a potential conflict of interest.
Yeah. And moreover, even if the money goes to the family member, you know how easy it is for family members to give gifts to one another and that kind of thing. So you don't think that this is a family operation and everybody in the family benefits directly or indirectly. And that's why we have these domestic and foreign emoluments clauses. We don't want to have loyalty to the United States deflected by financial obligations or incentives that focus on personal enrichment rather than on what's good for the country. I can't hear you. Okay.
Sorry, these are, I was coughing, so I didn't want to interrupt. Okay. Yeah, these are very troubling issues where, we should have, what we need to have. I spoke to somebody the other day, was saying, "Oh, these are great. Aren't you so happy they're shrinking the government?" And this person is retired now and on Social Security. And I said, "Look, you're happy with the government just indiscriminately, not sending out checks out that have been, because someone in the government suspects and is investigating whether the payments are fraudulent or not fraudulent. So while the government is investigating this stuff, that they're withholding payments." Well, now Musk came out the other day and said there might be evidence that that the database, if Social Security is flawed. I wonder how people would feel if Trump applied the same principle and just stopped and withheld all Social Security payments. So, because that's the principle he's applied. I'm saying I'm saying there might be fraud here. So my response to fraud is I'm not stopping the payments. I'm freezing them while they investigate the fraud. So why is this being applied by merit, or what's the play? Or is this a discrimination where you might see fraud in some place and you freeze the payments, and then seeing fraud in another place where you're not freezing the payments? So what's the logic behind when you see fraud and why you're freezing payments in some circumstances and not freezing payments? It seems to me what they might suspect right now is that the biggest fraud is in Social Security. So why aren't they freezing all the payments in Social Security to investigate it? Because that's been what they've established. That's their excuse for freezing payments, is they have to investigate the fraud. So because they know how people will respond. So when it's other people's check is being stopped, people don't care. When it's their check being stopped by the same principle that's stopping other people's check, okay, then they care. Okay, that's called hypocrisy. Okay,
yeah, for sure.
Being full of shit. Okay, so if the government's going to stop the check, freeze checks of everywhere they find fraud, they should do it everywhere, not selectively. Okay,
yeah. And the biggest place where they're not doing it, Jeffrey, is in the Defense Department, defense contractors. You're not hearing that checks to Northrop Grumman or Boeing or Lockheed Martin are getting their checks frozen, even though we know a staggering amount of fraud and overcharging. Even those who are involved in the defense contracting will tell you that. And again, it's because we have the military-industrial security complex, $1.5 trillion. They always get their way. It doesn't matter whether it's Trump or Biden or Obama or W. They've been in control ever since Eisenhower left the White House. He was the only one, being a war hero, that could tell the Pentagon people, you're full of crap, to be vulgar about it. He said, I know how to fight wars. He could face them down. Once he left, we don't have anybody else of that stature. So they all get steamrolled by the military-industrial complex. They're smart enough to make their plans in the key districts for members of Congress who sit on the key committees. And here we have $1.5 trillion unaudited. The Defense Department has never passed an audit in its life. Now, Jeffrey, you being a business guy, if someone came to you and said, I've had this business that's been around for 40, 50 years, it's never passed an audit, would you invest in it? You would say, wait a minute. You come back, you get it audited, you would consider it. We are having the same thing in the defense. Never.
I agree with that. We are every year how Congress can keep giving the military-industrial complex more money when it never passes an audit. They shouldn't even consider giving any increase. They should give the incentive. The best way to incentivize them to actually pass an audit is to say, not am I freezing your spending, I'm cutting your spending, and I'm going to cut it even more every month that passes where you can't satisfy an audit. You think that would change their incentive structure? The problem is the incentives. Nobody seemed to want to change. We don't need saviors. We need better incentives. We need to align incentives better. We need then as I talk about is once you do better job in incentive alignment, you make everybody a hero. You make everyone a savior. So we don't need to concentrate this power in one person who has special superpowers that supposedly has judgment, above and beyond, any other mere mortal human being. No, we have a lot of wisdom collective in people, and we just gotta create incentives for them to have a different sense of payoffs between what's an upside for them and what's a downside for them. And if we turn agents into principals because we align incentives better, then we'll get the collective wisdom of everybody, and because they'll get an economic benefit associated with applying their wisdom, as opposed to finding out where, they get no real reward for taking a risk. But so there's only downside. If the risk turns out positively, they get nothing. If the win turns out negatively, they get fired. So the incentive is to be, just uber risk averse, and that's not good. We want to align incentives so that basically everybody feels like they're a principal, because ultimately every citizen is a principal in the country. Yeah. So all our incentives should be aligned because we're all principals.
Yeah.
So
we hang together or we hang separately.
Bad incentive alignment.
Let me explain, Jeffrey, why the system doesn't work in part. And this is a friend of mine who's in Congress. He says, this is the way Defense Department comes and briefs members of the Armed Services Committee. They want to buy a new weapon. It says the members look at nothing with regard to the justification for the weapon, whether it'll work. They shift immediately to the last page of the briefing, says how many jobs will be created in my district. If it's a good number, you're for it. That's it. They don't examine whether or not these are going to be white elephants. So they vote for it. And so Congress has this perverse incentive not to hold the Pentagon accountable if they think that the waste is going to be spent in their district. And that's another example of how the Congress doesn't work anymore, because we have professional politicians. They want to stay in office forever. They don't think they're ever going to go back and live as ordinary citizens. And so professional politicians, they figure, hey, this is a way in which they can stay in office instead of saying, I want to sue the government and get out of office.
I had a guy, Bruce. I had a guy that worked for me once, one of my first companies, and he was a retired guy who, before retirement, was one of the main controllers at the Pentagon. And so, we would sometimes talk politics, and then he would, and then when I would ask him about cutting the defense spending, and he said, yes, every time, people come to us and say, well, we're going to cut defense spending, they go and say, okay, we're going to cut the base in your state. We're going to cut the base in your state. And he actually told me how they source their purchases are tied to who was influencing defense spending in Congress. So he said, it's not necessarily, a lot of their spending is not how to be the most efficient military organization. A lot of spending is associated with the fact is, how do you create the incentives so that Congress never will have the incentive to ever decrease your spending, but they only want to increase their spending because they don't want to be the ones who have voted for job losses in their district. So he said they're very strategic in how, and how they source. So in case, discipline wants to be applied against them, he told me he thought that the government could spend 1/3 the amount it was spending on defense and still have the level of preparation it needed, to confront all the risks that the nation funded. And he thought the spending was absurdly high, and he was the controller. So I think so he saw all the numbers. So he knew all the games that were playing, and I'm sure there's a lot more that he didn't want to tell me. I can understand why he wouldn't want to tell me, but if we really want to respect the taxpayer, the outside of the largest part of the budget is defense spending, outside of interest on the debt, which there's no control over unless the government controls it by defaulting on it. So you would assume that you'd start where the government spends the most amount of money. So I think that's what a smart business person would go in saying is, you have an entity that, as you said, has not passed an audit, in almost a decade, and it's where the most amount of money is spent. You would assume that that's where you'd start.
Now, I'd say this, Jeffrey, on a larger domain. You need to be in Washington to understand that all the incentives, work against the public good and the American people. And that's oftentimes true with government in general. It doesn't mean that you in government, because maybe we disagree. I still think, in a state of nature, and as life is poor, brutish, nasty, and short, as Thomas Hobbes said. But it means that because there are so many negative features to government, especially the incentive structure, that there should be a presumption that government should do nothing unless you make a very convincing case that the private sector is really horrible. That's why we have separation of powers, so that you got to make your case to the House, the Senate, the executive, and then the courts. I repeat, it's not going to be perfect, because human beings are not perfect, but we're searching for the optimal system, not the perfect system. It's better than all the alternatives. And that's what people oftentimes forget. They see a problem and say, oh, let's get government to treat it because it's a problem. Not if the government's going to make the problem worse. And you don't want the government to, you just live with the problem, you recognize it. And there's this impulse to try to make everything perfect, even if you can't make it perfect, and it's better to live with what you have. Again, there's no iron rule that's going to substitute for brains, drawing lines, making decisions that are matters of degree. But all experience teaches we should be very wary before we entrust any power to government. Doesn't mean that you never give it, but you require a really convincing case. And I think you can make a convincing case when you need armed forces to protect yourself. And you need a case for police, to enforce the laws against mayhem and robbery and murder. Beyond that, I think the case has become very weak. And we need to just resist this temptation to think that simply because something is wrong, the way to make it better is to get the government involved. Most of the time, that's wrong.
I wonder if what our military budget would be like if we followed the maxim or the principle of what we should fight for, as described by Smedley Butler, who wrote the book War is a Racket, and he knew from personal experience because he was given the responsibility, in numerous cases. He led the military, and at the point in which he died, he was the most decorated soldier in American history. And he said, so he knows what he's talking about. Like Eisenhower, who knows war, Smedley Butler knew war, and he said there are only two things we should fight for. One is defense of our homes, and the other is the Bill of Rights. Yeah. So what kind of military budget would we need if that's basically all we needed was to defend and fight for?
I think Jeffrey, to probably something like 10%, because I think what goes unstated there is that the greatest military asset any country has is the willingness of people to fight and die for the country when there's something serious at stake. And they don't necessarily have to be professionally trained soldiers. We didn't have professionally trained soldiers at Lexington and Concord who beat the British in 1775. They knew they were fighting for freedom and liberty. They're going to take risks, and they won. And as long as you are creating a society whose citizens love the country and the government because it's not mulcting them, they'll turn out. They'll volunteer. You won't even need conscription, and you'll win the war because you have something worth fighting for. It's that unquantifiable element of defense that goes unknown. That's what we need to rely upon. I mean, I would, if I'm fighting for my home, even that I'm over age, of course, I'll do anything. Self-defense is natural to the species. And I think we could get there, Jeffrey, maybe 10% of what we spend now on the military and still be as safe as we are today, if not safer, because we're not antagonizing people by going abroad and searching for hornets' nest bust open.
So I think basically, Bruce, it seems like in this conversation, I think we've demonstrated that we probably could save the federal government a lot more money than Elon Musk can. Yeah, and do it without intruding on people's privacy by looking to get access to everybody's personal information, which is still unclear, why he needs it, and nobody seems to be explaining to anyone why he needs it. If there's a simple explanation, why not offer the simple explanation? Again, this is an issue is, I don't want to conflate again the issue of, are you against the government rooting out corruption and things like that? No, of course not. The best way to end corruption is shrink the government so the government does a lot less. That's the best way of rooting out corruption, is have the federal government do a lot less than it currently does. Okay. Yeah. And if the federal government is 3% of GDP, not a lot of people are going to be bribing it to do things for it. If the government can't create rules, can't create regulation, can't dole out preferences, can't dole out privileges, and is itself doesn't have a big budget to buy things, okay, people will basically say there's no money to be made here, so there's no return from attempting to corrupt it, because there's not enough upside in attempting to corrupt it. I'm not going to invest a lot of money in attempting to corrupt it. So because of how big government is, and how consequential its decisions are, invites corruption. So, very simple. We people can, for Social Security, very simple. Give people back the money that they've accrued in their accounts and make them responsible for saving for themselves moving forward. No, then you don't have to worry about any corruption in Social Security payments. Medicare, give everybody the money back and let them buy their own health care, and with all the funds that have been accumulated for the payments they've made, let them give it all back to them, whatever's been accrued, whatever is theirs. Okay, it's a function of what they've paid in and the interest earned on what they paid in. Just give it to them back and let them pay for itself. We've had a generation, until World War II, that was able to live without these things. So how incapable are we, if we can't live without things that basically people live without for 160 years of our country's history. So very, very simple. Okay. We don't need a Fed. McKinley, apparently Trump thought McKinley was a great president. He was a great president without any Fed existing, so we don't need the FDIC. We don't need the SEC. We were a great country, prior to any of these things. So we want to make America great again. We don't need to have to worry about rooting out the bad spending of the state. We need to shrink the state. Okay, we need to shrink the scope of the activities that the state does. And now we're not seeing really a rollback.
I'd say that we have all these efforts at campaign finance reform. I say, listen, the best campaign finance reform is shrink government. Don't worry, these business people are not going to throw money into campaigns if it's not going to return on their capital investment with some regulatory benefit. Now, the other thing I'd like to observe is this, Jeffrey. All of what we say requires a basic change in the American culture and the American people to cherish liberty and the march of the mind over war, the armored knight, and domination of the world. The reason why all of these things, or most of them, were created is because by the time of McKinley, especially we're in the Philippines, we denied them self-determination, we're into Guam, we're into Puerto Rico, is that we decided, let's be a warfare state. Let's run the world. You have to have a Caesar if you have an empire. You can't run an empire without a Caesar, right? And then we ended up with a Caesar. We got to renounce empire. We got to renounce Madeleine Albright. We're bigger and taller than everybody else. We're far when we fight, it's only for good reasons. We have to repudiate that and say, no, we want our emblem to be liberty, the march of the mind, rule of law, period. We don't need obelisks. We don't care whether we're number one around the world. We just need to be number one for ourselves, which is honoring everybody's individual liberty to march to their own drummer, use their own ambitions and talents and faculties to find their own fulfillment. We don't need anything more. We don't need pyramids. We don't need any spectacles in the sky. We don't need to go to the moon. We don't need to go to Mars to make us a great country. We just need to honor individual talent and discipline. That ought to be our legacy.
If we would be a lot more productive if we let people keep their money than spending it on their behalf. So, and that's why if you take a look at the type of nature of the innovations today, I mean, they're less consequential than the innovations in the past. So, again, it probably is a poor set of incentives, and people are not inclined to take the type of risk they are. Of course, when you have the government taking, when you spend, about half the year working for the government, and then half the year working for yourself, rather than working for yourself, all year long. And again, and going back to the person again that Trump has referred to, McKinley, he's demonstrated that you can have, a balanced budget, which McKinley had, without an income tax, without a central bank, without a regulatory state, without almost all these regulatory bodies. So if he admires McKinley, so much, let him try to accomplish what McKinley accomplished as far as empire building, with only spending 3% of GDP, and not having a central bank finance your deficit. So there's a reason why when a central bank didn't exist, we ran basically balanced budgets, and that since we decided to go with fiat money, printed by the financial bankers and central bankers, we've had inflation and huge government deficits. Again, going back to your point, part of shrinking government is removing the government from the ability to print money, and so we have to separate money from the state in order to shrink the state.
Yeah.
So,
but Jeffrey, I'll just on that point, Jeffrey, that's only going to happen if we renounce the warfare state. It wasn't an accident that the income tax and the Fed is created just before we enter World War I.
1913.
Just as the Bank of England was created just when British decided we want to be an empire, let's attack the Dutch, let's attack the French, and whatever. We have to get away from this celebration of the armored knight and domination being greatness. It isn't. Liberty is greatness. That's what makes the Declaration of Independence so wonderful. Unalienable rights you're endowed with by our Creator. We need to go back to that basic understanding of why we exist. We don't exist to walk the world like a colossus. No, that's not the reason why the United States is around. And if you look at the reason why we ended up with the Fed and the currency the way it is because we're fighting all the wars. And the Secretary of Treasury at the time, William McInerney, said to Wilson, the president, we cannot go to war in World War I on taxes. We need the Fed there to buy these bonds so they won't revolt against going to war to make British and the French empires bigger in the name of democracy. He understood that. We need to get away from this idea that our greatness is world domination, or otherwise it's all going to fall back as soon as we stop speaking.
Yes. Our greatness was when the world wanted to emulate us.
Yes.
And they wanted to emulate us. We conquered them. We conquered the world through the idea of freedom and liberty.
Yeah.
Okay. We didn't conquer the world initially through the use of force.
Yeah.
So the strongest weapon, as you said, Bruce, so well, is that America's greatest selling point, is liberty and freedom. That's what our founders, the conceptual framework of the Constitution became the framework that became the role model for many countries around the world. They've been implemented with varying degrees of success, but it became the template, that every government, that most governments, I should say, looking for legitimacy, whether they actually practice it or not, the way they establish legitimacy is establishing a constitution that resembles our constitutional framework. So, what our founders did was not only a gift to America, it was, that's the whole point. You say it's an idea. It's an idea that transcends any border. And that's the greatest thing we've given to the world, and we give it to ourselves, not us, not you or I. I think you and I are trying to remind people that that's our greatest gift that we've given people, but that was a gift given by George Washington and James Madison and Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson and George Mason and Dickinson and so many other people, who contributed to, the constitutional, framework, of a system of limited government, where the main objective of government was to preserve people's inalienable rights. We were the first country, to establish that basically every human being is endowed with rights from nature. No government had a right that was legitimate to interfere with those natural rights, those inalienable rights, and the main role of government is to protect them. So, and a democracy does not protect them because that's mob rule. That's why they had a constitutional republic. So there could not be either tyranny of the majority or the tyranny of the minority. There could not be tyranny because it would be limited. So not much of power would accrue anywhere.
Yeah. I mean, let me go back and just show you, how far we've gone as a country in terms of the ethos and culture. You remember early on, in our life as a nation. There was a famous or infamous XYZ affair. We sent ambassadors abroad to negotiate with France in order to avoid any kind of war. Well, Talleyrand and the French, they tried to basically extort us. Said, hey, you pay us some money, pay us some bribes, and maybe we'll talk to you. Called the XYZ affair, right? We said, are you kidding me? Yeah, we totally walked away from that. And it was a big big furor against the French because they were trying to use their positions to extort us for money. I mean, that's what we do right now. We go around, okay, can you do some more spending here, do more spending here? It's quid pro quo. It's like a business transaction, which is how the French were treating international relations, a business transaction. And that was viewed as horrifying to Americans at that time. Today, it's standard operating procedure. That shows you how far we've come.
Yes. So Bruce, excuse me. So I'd like to now have you, excuse me again, everyone. Why don't you sum up and all the other things that you'd like to get said, you know, so you have the last words and this always very enjoyable conversation.
Yes. To all the audience, be engaged, and we cannot succumb to emulating the tactics of our opponents. We want things done by the rule of law. We need to support the courts. We need to be careful about not using no reason to be incendiary. We don't need to be defamatory or anything. I think we need to make clear that we're in favor of all Americans. They can be wrong and we can try to correct them, but we're still all Americans. If we don't hang together, we hang separately. That was true when Benjamin Franklin said it 250 years ago. It's true today. So we don't view persons as enemies. We can oppose ideas, but we're all human beings. And even if that kind of attitude is not prevalent now in Washington, we cannot stoop to emulate the enemy. If we do that, we're totally lost. That's what I'd like to conclude with, Jeffrey, today.
Thank you so much, Bruce, and I hope you have a wonderful day.
Thank you.
Bye.